Hello everyone, and welcome to another Gear Talk. We are currently going to, if you can't tell by the changing lights behind me, talking about a myriad of things involving Gears of War. So what are we talking about? We're talking about all the different factions that exist in Gears of War. That's right, we're going to talk about every single group that exists, the major players. There are some minor ones here and there, but mostly we're going to talk about like the big ones that are playing big roles in the entire story right now. So, for instance, one thing I can bring up is like the Grievous Bodily Love is like their own little group, or like the Hivebusters, but I've categorized them within, like, for instance, the Grievous, we have the Stranded. When we have the Hivebusters, that is the Cog. Even though they have nothing to do with those, if you had to sit down and say who their allegiance falls to, or like who they like represent the most, or like what they're fighting for, it's basically those sides. So we're going to cover all of them, just the major players, and just go over some examples and just talk about the factions themselves, or what they're doing, or who they are, and all that kind of stuff, and cover that for Gears of War, the factions. The first group we'll talk about is the Cog, or basically who we play as through like the majority of all the games is the Cog. So the Cog is the Coalition of Ordered Governments. We're not going to go too heavy into all this because the Cog has a very big history, and also because I want to save like the actual Cog discussions for when I do a Cog discussion series. But basically the Cog is the Coalition of Ordered Governments. It is a grouping of governments or countries that all fall under one banner, the Cog. Basically think of it kind of like you have countries when it came over to like earlier on in like the 1900s, when it was like you'd have like the Ottoman Empire, or you'd have like the USSR, you know, the Soviet Union, all these different places, or even like the UN is like an example. Obviously they're not all the same kind of thing, but just when it comes to like talking about a grouping of countries, where these countries fought under the banner of the Cog. They were their own separate nations, but they fell under Cog control. They fought for the Cog. There were nations who were not under the Cog but fought for them, like the Southern Islands. They were not a part of them, but they would fight for them. They were like the best snipers there were, and they would do it for the Cog, but they were not Cog. They were Cog affiliated, but they weren't a part of the Cog. Basically, the Cog was just a grouping of governments, and we see them as like the major military powerhouse. And the only other one we have is who we're going to be covering next, the UIR. But they were the big ones that really were like, you know, we believe in like the people serve the government. It should always be that way, and we're going in and we're going to fight the good fight, and we're going to have this utopia, and they're going to follow all of these rules that are put in place. So really, it's funny. We brought it up many times in all these videos. Even though the Cog, by the sound of that, for me, I live in America, that doesn't sound right. You see that no one's the good guy in Gears of War. We just follow the Cog because like the winners write history, and they are the winners, and we are fighting for the Cog. For instance, like when you look at like Warhammer 40k, and you look at humanity, or like the Space Marines in general, some of their things don't seem the most ethical. That's kind of how it is. It's like we're the top dog, so live with it. Our rules are go by. That's how the Cog kind of operates. But the Cog is one of these forces, and some of the factions that we find inside the Cog that fight for the Cog is, for instance, we have like the Onyx Guard. Now the Onyx Guard I'm bringing up, it's like no duh, the Onyx Guard are with the Cog. But the Onyx Guard, you need to understand, like the Cog is broken into like their government chain and their military chain. Now everything kind of falls under one huge like oligarchy, if I'm using that word correctly. My wording for garchies are not the greatest, but basically all of it's under one, but then inside of it you have the different branches. For instance, like you have the military right here, but the government encompasses everything. Just because the military has control of combat doesn't mean that the government can't step in and make rules. That's where we have the Onyx Guard. The Onyx Guard falls in their own little bubble. So the Onyx Guard can go and do something and not pertainly listen to what the military is saying. So for instance, let's say Hoffman is trying to bark in order at a high-ranking Onyx Guard. The Onyx Guard can just say, no, we're not going to do that. No way, we've got a mission to do already. See ya. The Onyx Guard does not have to take rules. The only people the Onyx Guard take rules from are the actual government of the Cog. They are the only ones. So if the Prescott or the chairman says go do this, they do it. That is their, like, that's who they're listening to. Their higher-ups are the government. It's kind of, I brought it up before, like, it's like One Piece when you have, like, the Navy or the Marines, and then you have, like, the CPs. The CPs, the cipher poles, they listen to whatever the actual world nobles, the government is saying. And yes, the military does too, but they work in their own separate areas. They don't like work together. They work doing their own things. They're commanded obviously by the government up here, but then chain of commands here are different than over here. So I wanted to bring that up as like, you know, we have the military, but then the Onyx Guard, they're doing their own thing over here. And then the other group that we have is a more recent one that's come into play, the Hivebusters. Now, I didn't really want to put the Hivebusters here originally, but the Hivebusters bring up a very interesting point to make when it comes to the cog, whether it be old or new. Much like the Southern Islands, the Hivebusters technically do not have affiliation with the cog. They fight for the cog, but they are not in affiliation. Because when they were set up and everything, they were originally told, like you had Keegan, Lonnie, and Mac, they were all told, like, yeah, this is, ordered by the government. This is cog. That's what Hoffman told them. And then you learn later, like, no, they're going rogue and they're just doing this. But the cog really isn't stopping them. Like, the people who even know about the Hivebusters are not stepping in because the Hivebusters are a needed thing. So that's where the Hivebusters fall in. They're not aligned like the South Islands, but they are going out and they're actually doing the work and fighting. So they're not their own faction, most definitely not. There's less than like a dozen members or people that even know about the Hivebusters. But they are going out and fighting for the cog. They're like a little mini faction inside of the actual cog itself. Next up, we have the opposing forces, the UIR, or the Union of Independent Republics. So with these guys, this is like what you have for like America. This is kind of how America is put together. They're all republics. They're like, it's all like, it's funny because the cog is like the opposite of American politics, and then the UIR is like a lot closer. It's even written by Karen Travis. She related them to more like Bulgarian or Romanian type people. Swap around the beliefs of like the USSR back in the day and like America kind of. Swap those around, but still keep the same people living in each country. That's kind of how it works. It's really weird. Like, if you look into it, like I said, no side's the good guy. The UIR has just as many bad things. Like, torturing or human rights and everything, they'll throw that out the window. They do not care. So the UIR is basically the other side of the world, and they also have their own grouping of countries that fight under the UIR. The UIR is not against going in and taking over countries and having them join, like we see with Vaskar. They were very heavily, though Vaskar was a neutral nation, they were not against walking in there, setting up bases, and essentially taking it for their own without putting their name on it. The UIR was, and some of the bigger characters we know from the UIR were like Trescu and Paddock, but the UIR was basically the people that were against the cog. They believed that their version of government and their beliefs were right. They believed that they had the right to emulsion. That's what the whole battle for the Pendulum Wars was started over, was emulsion. And they believed, like, no, it's our right to have that. We believe our group is right in having this. And these also are the different kind of political views we have compared to you. So that's where the fraction or the split between both of them came, was because of the fact that they were at war over emulsion and they both had their own different views on how it should be done. So the UIR, we don't get as much as we would throughout the story. We get a lot of stuff here and there, but not as much as the cog. The cog gets so much history that it barely scratches the surface compared to, like, if you looked at everything for like the UIR. And speaking of the UIR, one of the very well-known factions, or at least the ones that we know very well, like the mini faction inside the UIR, are the Gorazny, or the Goraznian people. So these were the people from the country of Goraznia, and they were like the very, very last surviving members of the UIR. We figure this out later on with Vectis in the books. For instance, you have Jacinto's Remnant, Anvil Gate, Coalition's End. We cover a lot of the Goraznian people. We get a lot of the Gorazny. So the Goraznian people, they are very... The right way is to say, like, everyone fights. It's not just like we have our civilians who don't fight and our soldiers. No, everyone is ready to fight. They obviously have very well-trained people, but even like the elderly, the children, they are also ready to fight at a moment's notice. They are ready to put their lives on the line. The Gorazny do not F around. We see that there are only very, very few of the Gorazny. For instance, we meet them basically inside of a submarine, and we find the rest of them later on are over at the Embar Star, basically just like surviving. They're just trying to live. And when everything happens, they're about to lose everything. They don't have any options. They join the cog. So technically, I talk about what happened with all the factions. The cog is still around, but at this point in time, technically the Gorazny, or the UIR in general, is officially ended and defeated because they join the cog and they become cog citizens. Now, this is obviously a little weird for everyone involved because these sides don't really like each other, but this is during the Lambent epidemic, this is during the Stranded insurgency, there's a lot of stuff going on. So they're like, we can kind of put this aside if it means we all get to live. So they officially kind of end there with Coalition's End. Even the COG government is disbanded before the end of the war. They come together again. But once everything is done with Coalition's End, they are actually given a ship and they are actually sent out. And they are basically like their own nation again with Trescu involved and in charge. And later on, they do assist the Cog in fighting off and saving humanity at the very end of the Locust War, but they do leave once again. So we don't get a lot of what happens to them from here on out, but it's my assumption. I'm assuming they're going back to Groznia to rebuild. I would assume that's what they're going to do. I can't really see what else the plan is. They're not just going to live on the ocean the rest of their lives. There are very, very few Groznia. I think they even said like there's only thousands of them left. But, I mean, humanity states if you have a certain amount of people, you can rebuild. So they're currently out, I'm assuming, at Groznia trying to rebuild everything. But we were never given anything else. I haven't read the most recent books that take place of like what's going on with everybody after the war. But by the sound of it, they don't talk about the Grozny at all. So I'm assuming they're back over at Grozny just rebuilding. Next up, we have the Locust. Our main big enemy from the original trilogy, the original series games, the Locust. So the Locusts were actually very interesting. Their history is not that large. They actually started like roughly from the events of E-Day back. They're only like maybe up to 100 years old for their actual race. They multiply extremely quickly, and it's the fact that after everything that happened at Mount Kadar and the secret research place, when everyone broke free and Mira got everyone out of there, she led them all to Mount Kadar, and that's where she actually ended up like having the kingdom formed. The Locusts were actually building and thriving inside of deep in Kadar and into the hollows at Nexus, and you see that the species starts to evolving it bigger, where you have like the Ragers, you have the Cantus, you have the drones, you have the boomers, all of this stuff. They start creating their beasts thanks to Ukon. For instance, you have the Corpsers get turned into their own thing, like he's genetically playing with them. You have the Brumox, you have the Wretches, you have all of these creatures that are being experimented on and created, and it's just a thriving group, which we'll talk about this group next. They're doing decent until they have to deal with the Lambent or Lambency, which that is a faction. We'll touch on that soon. They're doing their own thing. They decide to invade the surface, and that's where they start to attack. That is where E-Day happens, and then all the events of the games take place after that up until the end of 3. So not really a lot of history to touch on with the Locusts. After the war's over and Adam's countermeasure, Adam's machine goes off, almost all the Locusts are killed off or cocooned right there. The mass extinction event happens that triggers the evolution into the swarm, which we will also talk about that coming up. And there are some Locusts that are still alive. They are basically living out in like deserted areas of the hollows and trying to hide out. And that's where the Cog are sending out like shock troops to go and take care of them. But mainly that is like them. They're surviving until the last are dying off and killed. And then that's where the swarm comes in 25 years later. So their history kind of just ends there. I can't really think, like, if you, prominent members, sure, why not? Mira, Karn, Rom, Ukon, Scourge, Shrock, there's so many, there's so many characters we meet, especially in the comics for Rise of Rom, so many you meet. And I do like the Locusts. I just wish the Swarm option was done a little better, but that's a whole other can of worms. We'll talk about the Swarm coming up. But for right now, onwards, we talk about our next group. Talking about the Lambent. Yes, I do consider the Lambent their own faction or group because of the fact that this group had a lot of creatures under its command. So we still don't know the whole story of the exact nature of Lambency or the Lambent. I'll just call it Lambent because at this point Lambency is just the disease version of it. So the Lambent, as far as we are given information and I have accumulated throughout my years of playing Gears, is that it is a parasitic organism that lives inside of emulsion, or at least the emulsion can cause Lambency, turning something lambent. As far as I can tell, it seems that Lambent has their own form of hive mind, a very bestial version of it, because of the fact that you have all these creatures that are fighting, but they're fighting in a unified style, or they know what the enemy is and are attacking said enemy. It's not like zombies that are just rising up and just randomly walking up and hitting something. They have a very decent idea of what they're attacking. Also, the things they take over, it seems like muscle memory or past memories are still there because firing guns is still a thing. So I'm assuming Lambency is its own major hive mind that's parasitic that goes out, and as far as we can tell, it just wants to take over the world and just have a Lambent world and just take over more bio things, creatures, energy. I don't know. The end game's never given. It's just a major problem and it's parasitic. That's all we get. We don't really get any more definition than that. That's the Lambent. Notable members. There's none with names, just creatures. We have the Lambent Berserker. That's always a memorable one. I remember that forever. That was amazing. I love that boss fight. You have the Lambent Wretches, are the first ones we ever meet, but that's about it. That's it. After the countermeasure goes off, basically lambency and emotion and all that is rendered like inert, inactive. It's just gone. So as far as I can tell, lambency or the lambent in general just doesn't exist anymore. And even if it does, it's in something very small or something that doesn't affect the world anymore. So as far as we're aware right now, the lambent are a faction that no longer exist. Up next, let's talk about the Swarm. Why not? Let's get all the evildoers out of the way before we touch on our next few groups. So, the Swarm. This is what later on we have the Locusts turning into. They become the Swarm. Now, it's important to state that they are still the Locusts. These are just the Locusts that have risen up and have come back after the 25 years of peace. They're emerging from their cocoons and burial sites. The Locusts are still around. This is the Locust. Mira, in a form, is still leading them through Reyna, so this is still the original enemy, just back again, but they do go by the Swarm. And it seems like, aside from like the Swarm themselves that are just like, we're just the enemy, they don't really consider themselves having a name. They're just like, we're just the enemy, and everyone else calls them the Swarm. But they are the Locusts. The Swarm is considered their own faction. They have their own insignia. They have everything. So some notable members. The Speaker. The Speaker is a very well-known one, a very underrated villain that did very nothingness, so I guess he's just as low-key as he could be. But then you also have characters like Reyna/Mira, who's now involved, and you see these are very monstrous, grotesque creatures. Like, they're all very goopy, and the evolution from the Locust to Swarm has taken, and it's more of like, we take in the biomass now, and we're evolving ourselves. For instance, they are taking, civilians, COG, UI, it doesn't matter who, they'll take anybody, and they'll turn them into juvies. The juvies will emerge into, I think, Imagos were the name of the next ones, and then they actually come out as the actual drone soldiers. So they are turning others into the Locust. Now, the Locust had a very primary, primitive way to do this when Ukon was around, of take you torture chambers where we can kind of pseudo transform people. It was a little bit of a makeshift way to do it, but after Ukon was dead, that technology was gone. That didn't exist anymore. So then you have it where, now the Swarm can just do it. It's just a normal thing they can do, pod you, and then boom, now you're a part of our army. That's just something they were able to do. Right now, the Swarm is still very powerful, and since they actually do have an actual queen involved with Reyna/Mira, they're working at full efficiency brain-wise, because without anyone plugged into the hive, they're not working at full power. They're very primitive, kind of. They understand guns and everything, but they're very primitive mindsets, like shoot, battle. But then when you get someone hooked up as the queen or at the head of the hive, they realize they have a form of sentience, or oh, I should wear armor because if I get shot, I could die. Let's make armor. Oh, these guns are nice, but if we made our own, we can fire our own and we can make our own ammo. We should do that. They become a bit more cognitive in their minds. So right now the Swarm is still a threat and that is being dealt with by the new COG, and also, like I said, with the COG factions, the Hive Busters is jumping in. That's mainly their targets. So yeah, Swarm's still up and moving around. The biggest faction, surprisingly, on this list, I wanted to save it to the end and all the different factions that come because of it, are the Stranded. The Stranded actually are very, very large. So they're very spread out. That's the weakness of the Stranded. And the Stranded are the people who, during E-Day, when everything came up and they're all fighting, it's just oh, we gotta, the army will save us, we'll be fine. A year after that, when everything's going foobar, they realize, oh no, things are still bad, and the government's just okay, we're gonna drop hammers and kind of wipe out everything. If you can't make it to the city in 3 days, sorry. And they're well, what do you mean? What do you mean if we can't make it? And then 3 days later, hammer comes down, sploosh, a lot of people died and a lot of people felt stranded by their government. Very, very simplistic way to bring it up, but that's essentially what being stranded is. So when all of that happened, a lot of them were very resentful and very hating of the COG. They do not like the COG. You left us to burn and die. Screw you guys. That's how the Stranded see it. So they are very spread out throughout the world, but there are very large pockets of them. For instance, and I have a list of 4 of them to give it a detail on what a large grouping of them looks like, or what they're named, and then groups that don't think of themselves as stranded, but very essentially they are stranded. There's no way around it. They fit and talk and act like stranded. They just don't see themselves as stranded. So the first one I have here is, and this is a big name, but this is also the largest stranded group we've ever met. This is the Lesser Islands Free Trade Association. These are pirates. There's no way to make it sound fancy in the title. They're pirates. So this group was actually around the Vectis area in that terrain around the oceans of Serrano. And they were going around and basically they were pirates. But they were very, by the title, they thought of themselves more of tradesmen. Or they were like, yes, we're good men if you make a deal. They were pirates. Short and sweet of it. In fact, this group was so massive, they had their own fleet of ships. But the weirdest thing is that whenever they tried to pinpoint where the fleet was or figure out what was going on, they could never find the fleet. Until an actual battle at Vectis happened where everyone's lives were on the line. Stranded, Gorazny, Cog, where the Strand were like, okay, we have to help you because if we don't, we're all going to die. So the fleet was pseudo-called, like not all of it, but a large amount was called in to help fight. So we do see it's a very, very large grouping of ships, and these are a stranded group that take to the ocean. They are very large, the largest we've ever seen. This is bigger than Griffith's group, which was like the city of Char. That's how big these guys were. And Michelson, at the time, who was like the head of like the naval side of the Cog when they were on Vectis, he even says, like, could we defeat them? We probably could defeat the group, the stranded group that's out on the ocean. But the fact is that they are so large, we would not walk away unscathed. We would lose so much, and we probably would not recover. So there's just no point in fighting them. If it came to an all-out head-to-head fight, we would win, but we aren't walking away unscathed. We're going to take some heavy damage, and we can't afford to do that. So this was a big enough threat. The Cog was like, we're going to back off and not deal with this, because if we do, we can win, but we lose in the long run. So they never touched this group. They've dealt with this group, but they never touched them in a way of like combat. Which at this time, during everything involving the Lambency, yeah, not really a good idea for any side to fight each other, but for some reason that was a thought in their heads, like, maybe we could take them. We don't know. But yeah, they were very much stranded, but they were like pirates stranded, and they were not to be joked around with. This was the biggest we've ever seen. Another group we have that does not consider themselves stranded, these are the Grievous Bodily Love. So this is basically like an Amazonian version of like women survivors that are stranded, that survived everything that happened at Jolene, which is like a birthing ground that was attacked by locusts. They survived all of that, and they were there basically raising like the kids from there, or like the children. They were like the defenders, and they were very skilled women in their own right for battle. Like they could hold off locusts, and they were doing very good. Now, the reason they don't see themselves as stranded, this all happened in 14 AE when Jolene was attacked. So they were around 14 years after, E-Day, 13 years after the hammer strikes. But these women were, and it's very dark what they get into for Baron, but these women were basically taken advantage of and forced against their will to do things to have children. So they aren't very highly viewing of the Cog, but they do see themselves as their own group. Like, they would, if they had to fight, they would rather fight for the Stranded than the Cog. They would rather trade with the Stranded than the Cog. Now, some of them see the Cog in a better light. Like later on at the end of Baron, there are some that, view like, okay, the Cog aren't 100% dickheads. So, there's that. But most of them prefer the Stranded. So they're more grouped into the Stranded. Another group we have is Paddock's old group from when we had over at Halvo Bay. So after the events of Halvo Bay and everything's done with Karn, Kilo actually goes out, and there's still a squad for maybe like a few more months after that before Paddock and Sophia go AWOL. They actually just leave. They just leave the squad altogether, the Cog, everything. They just leave because Paddock got into Sophia's head, or at least Sophia saw from Paddock's point of view, like his style of how like the government has done with the UIR and Gorazny, how he views things, and she sees that as being like, okay, he's making a lot of sense. So they leave, and Paddock starts up his own group of, and it's weird to say because he never considers himself stranded. He never does. But this is essentially a stranded group that makes theirself at Halvo Bay. And they're like survivors. Survivors are the better term because Halvo Bay, after everything, is a very desolate, destroyed place. He takes his survivors, and they're over there. Seahorse Hills is their main base of operations. But they basically have Halvo Bay as their terrain. And after everything is done with, like, later on in the war, we're towards the end of it, he's still there with everybody, but now things have gotten harder. The Ragers are still calling Halvo Bay home, and he actually does make it out of there alive. He makes it to the end of the war with his survivors. The final group we have right here is actually Gabe's convoy, or Gabe's group, or Alpha as he calls it, when it comes to Gear's tactics. Now, after everything that happened with the hammer strikes and the hunt for Ukon, they had to, after they learned the truth about the locusts, they had to basically pretend they were dead. They dropped a hammer on an off location. They were all going to book it so that they thought that he killed Gabe and all of his people, when in reality they all lived, and they all basically left the cog. They don't really consider themselves like stranded either, because like they're fighting, hunting, they all have military training. They're just doing it off the books and over in Vaskar and parts of Tyrus, hunting down Ukon's monsters that are still left alive. So they don't see themselves as being, stranded, but they are. Gabe left, Sid obviously left with him, Echo Squad left with him. You have Michaela, who is already stranded. She was basically like, okay, I got picked up by the cog to help fight, even though I hate you, but I'll assist. Oh, you guys just left? I guess you're stranded like me now. That's essentially how it went. So the only one that was tried to stranded the whole time was Michaela, until the rest of Alpha ended up joining her, and then they're all stranded. The second to last faction we have is, at this moment in the story, for as far as we are, this is technically the smallest of the factions. This is the Outsiders. So the Outsiders are the people who, after everything that happened with the Locust War, the 25 years of peace, everything like that occurs, well, there's no war anymore, right? The cog has just built itself back up, but you still have the stranded that are still around. And it's just like, okay, the war's over, but you guys still essentially laser nuked us. Okay, we're not just going to say, oh, it's all hunky-dory now that the war's over. No, 99% of humanity's dead, okay? No, you just don't get off with a freebie. So we're not joining you for your rebuilt cog. We're out. See you later. And at this point, the Outsiders are born from the remnants of the Stranded. The Stranded build up and become what Outsiders are. So Outsiders, unlike the Stranded, actually have their own civilizations that they're building up, or their outposts. It's not just like a Stranded is like in an area surviving, and then they have to leave. And then, they're not like nomadic, like another group we'll get to. They're essentially just staying in one place. They rely a lot on trade. They're a lot more centered in their communities, and it's not just survival. They're trying to build up their own areas and groups. For instance, in the comic for Hivebusters, you see actual cities with statues that are built up for Outsiders. Like this, these are actual towns that are being made outside of the government. They run on their own rules, and they basically, like, it's unspoken, but each Outsider group runs by their own rules, but they all have, like, the main ones that they all kind of follow. They're all, not their own nations, but their own communities that run and dictate what they do, and they have, like, the leaders of these communities. For instance, the most well-known we have is when it comes to Gabe's, or later on it becomes Reyna's, but it's like their outpost was originally led by Gabe, then he passed, then Reyna took over, and then the Swarm became a thing, and that kind of took out that. That's basically the reason they're the smallest right now. The Swarm spent a lot of time picking off the settlements of the Cog, but they really had a buffet when they were going out picking up the Outsiders. The Outsiders were all picked up, and they were just slowly potted and transformed. That's what happened to Kate's entire village, mainly, except for a few survivors. And then you have it where the Cog comes in, and to fight the Swarm, when they learn about how big of a threat it is, they start bringing in the Outsiders into the Cog, effectively getting rid of a lot of the Outsider outposts. So they're the smallest. I believe it is stated there are still some that are out there, but there's not a lot. There's barely any Outsiders left, but the ones that are still out there are basically like in the same boat the Stranded were in. They're just surviving. The last group we have, and this barely makes it as a faction, but the reason it is because they run by completely different rules than Outsiders, are the Nomads. So the Nomads are actually a group that are really extremely similar to the Outsiders. The difference is that they have made it completely well known that they follow their own rules. There is no set rule of government that dictates them. And much like their name, they are a nomadic people. They are constantly on the move. They never settle in one place. Their leader, and even their leader still, is Paddock. Paddock is currently their leader. And he is the one that, like I said, they don't really dictate to like the rules of government in general. Like we don't follow COG rules or Garazni or Outsider. We live. That's what we do. We are nomads. We go out and travel the world. And they've actually expanded. Originally, they were throughout Tyrus. They would start wandering, but they've made their way over to Vaskar. Vaskar is where they currently call home, and they are currently expanding there. And as we can see with some of the Nomads we meet, they have the Vaskar dialect or even the accent. So it seems to me like it's not only the Tyrus people, but the Vaskar now following the nomadic ways, where you'll go to an area, scavenge what you can, and kind of call it good there and live for a bit before you pick up and start moving on. Now, like I said, they're a little different than when it comes to the actual Outsiders, because the Outsiders still have their basic governing rules for their groups, while the Nomads are basically like, okay, Paddock's in charge, he's the leader, let's get moving. That's essentially the Nomads. You know, like they'll be like, okay, Gabe is in charge. He has all these rules. We're going to try and set up trade and all of this. Oh, hey, we'll give you this for this. Oh, hey, you know, you seem a bit hostile. What if we can strike a deal so that we're both on the same page? Or like, hey, we'll bring you into our group. No. The Nomads aren't like that. Paddock, you're in charge. Okay, let's get moving. These guys seem cool. You want to be a nomad? Come on, be a nomad. Let's go. Let's start traveling. Let's go. Let's go, guys. Come on. Let's get going. That's just what they are. You know, the rule of law is just like, hey, Paddock's the leader of the Nomads. That's it. You know, they're a wandering nation is basically the best way to say it. So, yeah, the Nomads, they technically are their own faction. They don't side with any of the others. They are an actual group, and they are actually fighting. So, there you go. The newest group that made it in were the Nomads. So, congratulations, guys. I saved you for last. And that will do it. So, I think I covered everything. The only thing I really missed was when I was talking about the locust. I forgot the savage locusts. Basically, the locusts that are savage are just, they live on the land, they're cut off from the queen, but they still hail the queen. That's all it is. That's all it is. It isn't. They just refurbish everything around them and fight, like Stranded. That's it. So that'll do it for everybody. I think that covers all of them pretty well. There are some minor groups, obviously, that I did not cover. I wanted to cover like the major ones that are actually in play right now in the story or have had a major appearance and were actual threats or actual players on the battlefield. Like we had the Pensang warriors, but they fought for the Cog. And aside from like Bitax's family that were roaming around during like the Locust War, there was no faction. There was no military fighting force. There was nothing. You know, you have civilians on like Vectis, but they were just civilians. They were with the Cog anyway. You know, they just didn't know what was going on. Now, I think a fighting force, these are like the main ones. I think this is a pretty good covering of like all the groups. So, I want to thank everyone for watching. I want to thank everyone for making this possible. Thank the patrons for making things possible. And I will see you guys in the next video or the next Gear Talk, whatever I see you in. I love you all to death. It's going to be a great time no matter what we do. Catch you in the next one. Later.